welcome to everybody. This is our fourth episode in this series of webinars that we are hosting. And this is, next week will be our last one for this series, but don't worry, it's not the end of seeing us every week. The usual housekeeping rules apply, so we will be muting you while the presentation takes place. If you have any questions, just please post them in our chat box, and we will then get to them as we can, as we see the time. But if we don't answer all the questions during the actual time that we have, then we will email you some answers. And we will post the details of how to purchase Saxenburg wines at the beginning and the end of the chat, in case anybody would like to ask any or to purchase any of the wines. So welcome back, Dirk. You missed last week with us, but today we're going to be talking about the art of blending, and this is, I think, a real winemaker's forte, and then we're also going to have some insight into the use of wood in the winemaking process. Yeah. So to begin with, you know, you've spoken during these webinars about the building blocks of Saxenburg. What does that mean, and especially in the context? Sorry, I'm going to give you all my questions to start, and then you can, in the context of Saxenburg, since, you know, what does that mean? Because our private collection wines are all single varietal wines. So what does blending actually mean when we actually produce mostly single varietal wines? Over to you.
Yes. So, I mean, obviously, so we've got various vineyards, so especially on the varieties that we've got more hectares planted, like Shiraz and Sauvignon Blanc. We've got plenty of different blocks, and each of these different blocks have different sites and aspects. And I touched on that on some of the earlier webinars. So each of these gives you something completely different in wine style. So for me, is really during vintage or during harvest, it's all about making these true to their site, and then I talk about the puzzle pieces or the building blocks that I'm making in harvest. I'm not trying to make a final wine. I'm making something I know this block gives me big structure, so that's, I know, is going to be my structure component. So I try not to make it a finesse, elegant wine. That is, I let it be true to itself. I'll have components that are more acidic, more linear, and all of these building blocks I work on during harvest. And then when it comes to blending, it's really putting all of these puzzle pieces out on the table, tasting through all of them. And it becomes quite a big exercise, because you can imagine if I've got 20 different batches of Shiraz in the winery, they all go into barrels. We use different barrels. Some are first fill, some are second fill, some are third fill, from different cooperages. And so all of these are basically a building block on its own. Every single barrel is a building block on its own. So it becomes quite a big exercise to put all of these together in the right way, and to really make the best wine that you can. And you can I mean, the possibilities are endless. You can make so many different wines from the same building blocks, just because we have so many building blocks to work with.
Yeah, and I'm talking about from a Sauvignon Blanc point of view, which I know is what you've been working on furiously as well in the last few weeks. But I was fascinated the first time at my first vintage at Saxenburg, where there was, I think, well, how many different, and you keep them all separate through the winemaking process, and then when do you actually do the blending?
So it depends on the cultivar and the wine.
Okay.
So for like the Sauvignon Blanc, we've got different sites, and we have different yeast selections for each of the sites. That's then kept in tank the Sauvignon Blanc were kept apart until this week. We made the final blend up now, so it's always very exciting. But all of this, so the Sauvignon Blanc was made up now. For reds, it's a much longer process, obviously. So reds we're taking to barrel now, or this time of the year, we're taking that to barrel, and then next year, the middle of next year, more or less, we'll start looking at all of these components, and then when we take them out of barrel, we'll put them, blend all of these components together to make the wine. And then we can either take it back to barrel if I feel it needs a bit more oak aging, or we can just keep it in tank and then bottle. So it very much depends on the vintage. Some vintages get there quicker, some vintages needs a bit more time, and you have to be open to and not stuck to a recipe to be able to perceive the differences in each vintage.
Yeah, because there's two schools of thought, right? Either you do the blending first and then put it into the barrel and then see what happens, and then there's the other, we do the other one, which is we put them all separately into the barrels and then we blend it. So which is the better way around of doing it, or is there a better way? Let's say like that, rather.
Well, I'm going to think the way I do it is the better way, or else I wouldn't.
Okay, yes, I know. I must be careful what I say because I.
But no, so I like giving the wine its time. I think you can judge the wine a lot better given time. I mean, you can ask Vincent. We've been tasting through some of the wines now, and in a month it's amazing the difference already in some of the wines. Where the same with the Sauvignon, with the Shiraz especially, was some of the samples when we tasted it initially, just after pressing, we were like, one or two samples were like, oh, this is not really the quality, this is not really going to add much to the blend. That got sulfured up, settled out a bit more. 3 weeks later, we were like, oh wow, this is a fantastic component, this can really add something. So I think you run the risk of, when you blend too early, you run the risk of losing out on some interesting and some really fine components. So that's why I like to give it time. I read a beautiful quote the other day where they said you use the barrels to civilize your wine, because when you put wine in barrel, before they go into barrel, they're quite young and they're rough around the edges and quite sharp and edgy, and then you put them in the barrel, civilizes it. It makes it a proper grain. So
civilizes it. That's funny. I mean, I'm always fascinated by this blending process because I think it's amazing that one small difference between, the wine is all from the same block, let's say, yes, or from the same vineyard, all the Sauvignon Blanc or the Shiraz comes from the Saxenburg, yet just the small changes that you can make throughout the winemaking process then gives you this opportunity at the end to put the final piece together. So although we do these single varietal wines, they're actually all blends, really, at the end of the day.
And that's where I think the real skill comes into it. That's blending is probably the hardest thing to do sometimes. I mean, winemaking, you learn the basics, and it's a pretty simple process. The minimum, the basic stuff about it is pretty simple. It's pretty standard. You can tweak here or there, you can change extraction, all of that. But I mean, at the end of the day, you're going to end up with wine. But putting all of these components together is really where the skill comes in, I think, and that's where some of the best wines are set apart. It's by blending the finest components together and seeing, because it's also blending is not a 1 + 1 = 2 equation, because it's not, oh, this is a great wine and this is a great wine, so the wine they're going to produce together is going to be phenomenal. That's not the case. You sometimes put them together and they fight each other and the wine just never settles. So sometimes you use a weaker component, but you can see some good characteristics and you can see what it will add to the wine when you put it in. So everyone has different techniques about how they go about blending. I like to taste all my components and then bring the better components forward, taste through them again, and almost do a process of elimination, and then start with 2 components that each contribute something, and then I start building on top of that. Then I see, okay, I feel I need a bit more texture. Then I look for the textured components that I like to taste it. I add a bit of texture. Then I say, oh, I need a bit more acidity. And then I look for the acidity components that I tasted. And then you add all of this together until you get to. But I mean, that is sometimes blending takes half an hour. Sometimes it takes 3 weeks.
I've seen it take forever, actually, at times. But also, I guess once you put the blending blocks together, they also show up a little bit differently once they're together.
Yes, no, definitely. That's why I said it's not never a case of 1 + 1 = 2. It's yes. you can assume almost, or you can, if you blend and taste enough, you have an idea of what they're going to do when they get together, but you never quite know. So what I also like to do is, because you blend and you tend to taste and blend in quite a clinical environment, but I mean, we very rarely drink wine in a clinical environment. No one really, no one except maybe judges at a wine show it's a clinical environment. For the rest of the time, you're sitting relaxing at home, having it with dinner. So what I like to do is when I make up a blend, I make up a sample that I take home, put it in the fridge if it's white or red, and taste it over 1 or 2 days as well. And taste it not in a clinical setup, but as a setup where I would normally drink the wine, just to see how it holds up, you know, because and it's amazing because I've tasted, sometimes you blend a wine, you're extremely happy with it, and then you take it home and you taste it a day later and you're like, oh, this is missing, or, you know, I'm not quite happy with that. And then you start seeing other faults because you see it in a more real life environment. So I think that's all. Yeah, it takes obviously.
I didn't know you did that. That's fascinating. I didn't know that you actually, you know, you don't just keep it as, like you say, in the laboratory setting, which is super interesting. So then maybe onto the wood. I've read, you know, that oak is like the winemaker's seasoning, the winemaker's salt and pepper. You know, I mean, just some basic questions about maybe not necessarily Saxenburg's wood regime yet, but why do you use wood? What does it add? And maybe just talk about what we all know about oak barrels, but what other kind of barrels or vessels can you use in the process? And then maybe go on to what we actually do use at Saxenburg.
Yeah, so I think oak is it's a wonderful, it's really a wonderful vessel because it finishes it, like I said, it matures the wine, it civilizes it, and the one big reason for that, or the one very important factor, one of the most important factors about oak, is the fact that it breathes, so it allows a small amount of oxygen in. So as a winemaker, you're always walking this tightrope of oxygen is either a friend or a foe, and a little bit of it is a friend, but too much of it is terrible. So it's really, you have this love-hate relationship with oxygen. And in barrels, it's just this natural product just lets in the exact amount of oxygen that is beneficial. So the oxygen is beneficial, especially on red wines, on whites as well, but on reds, because for the tannins, so initially tannins are quite small compounds. That's why they taste quite harsh when the wines are young. But these, over time, these tannins bind up and they form longer chains, and then you can't taste them anymore and they become softer. But for this to happen, it needs oxygen. There needs to be an amount of oxygen in the wine for these chains to form, or for these tannins to polymerize. So that's really one of the major benefits of aging in oak, is you get that reaction. So the wine softens up, the wine becomes much more approachable. Obviously, then there's also all of the different factors in choosing the oak barrel, because each contributes flavor as well. So then you go into toastings. The more you toast the barrel, so toasting, for those people that do not know, when they make the barrel, they can put it over an open fire. That's the traditional way of putting it over open fire. Now, these days, they have different ways of toasting. You don't have to put it over fire anymore, but you put it basically over a fire, and you burn, to some extent, the inside of the barrel. The longer and the warmer the toasting, obviously, the blacker or the darker the inside of the barrel is, and the more dark, almost charry aromas you get from the barrel. The lighter the toasting, the more natural the flavor is, the more elegant the flavor is. So there's that decision. Then you look at the different forests or the different types of oak that you can use. So you have a few different oak trees and you have a few different forests. And the tighter the grain, so the slower the tree grows, the tighter the grain of the tree is, or of the oak barrel is, and the less oxygen it lets in, but it's also the less flavor it gives to the wine. So that makes a big difference as well. So you have to look at all these things. That's also why there's a big difference between American and French oak. So American oak generally is not to offend any Americans, if there are any Americans listening, but American oak is generally much more like Americans. They're engaging. It's American oak is there. It's you always know if it's in the room, and it gives you this vanilla and sweetness, and it's wonderful. It's quite it contributes quite a lot. But the negative side of that is it can be overpowering. So that's why we've moved across to doing 100% French oak. We get a lot more elegance. So we're progressing the style into a lot more restraint, a lot more elegance, a lot more finesse. So that's why we're going to more French oak barrels, and why we're going to lighter toasting. So 10, 15 years ago, a lot of people were using medium plus toasting, so quite a dark toasting. Now we're going to medium or even a light toasting, or what you call a blonde toasting. So the barrel, when you look inside the barrel, it barely looks toasted. And that's really to preserve the fruit, and the oak is just there to give a bit of texture, give a bit of mouthfeel, give that oxygen, but really not impart any oak flavors, because that can easily dominate the wine.
Yeah.
Oh, and then sorry, you forgot to say about other vessels. We only use oak and stainless steel at Saxenburg. So fermentation is in stainless steel, maturation is in oak barrels. But you can use concrete. You can use clay. Clay amphoras are quite popular now, becoming very, very popular. So there are, and each of these vessels, or each of these types, they all add something different, and it's all depending on what your style is, and if it fits into your style, and if you feel it will add a benefit. I don't think one must use all of these different types just for the sake of using it, or just to say, oh, I've got concrete, I've got clay, and I've got all of this. I don't think that shouldn't be you should look at it and see, this will add something to my wine, that will, at the end of the day, make it a better product. And that's really the starting point.
Yes, the thing about that is that each person has to have what they want, and yes, it's quite trendy to have those eggs, etc. But like you say, are they adding? Just a quick question on the oak, or not a question, a comment actually, that I've become fascinated in as well, is that you use different barrel suppliers in your selection. So it must be quite interesting to do those selections. But for those of you who have the chance to one day come and visit us at Saxenburg and maybe do a tasting, it's fascinating to see that, if you've got our Cabernet in 3 different barrels from 3 different coopers, and they can have 3 different completely different flavors, and I never knew that until I started working actually in a winery, and it is amazing that just the different whatever the coopers are doing to, I mean, that's a subject all in itself, I guess, so we shouldn't go into too much detail, but
it all depends on the forest, from where they source the oak from, how they season the oak. So oak barrels, it's not like you don't chop the tree down and make a barrel the same year. Generally, it's either seasoned, so the oak is left outside in the weather for at least 24 months, and your more expensive barrels are generally 36 months. So it leaches some of those harsher, greener tannins out of the oak. So that's a very important process, and each of them have different ways in stacking their oak staves, and all of that contributes. And then going into how they toast the barrels and all of that. So it is, like you say, you can have the same wine in 3 different barrels, and they're each completely different. And that's we normally play around. We have a core group of coopers that we use or source barrels from, because we know that works with Saxenburg, but there will always be 1 or 2 barrels, almost the more experimental barrels, to see what that can contribute. I think it's always an evolving process to see what works and what adds the most value to your product.
Exactly, exactly. So we've covered quite a lot of what we were going to talk about, but the one thing that you just touched on was about the first, second, and third full barrels. I often get questions about that. What does it actually mean, and how many times do we use our barrels at Saxenburg? And I see somebody has just asked the question of, and it's a very good question of, how much do barrels cost, because they are extremely expensive. I do know that, but yeah, maybe you just touch on those couple of subjects.
So I'll get to the cost now. So first, second, and third fill refers to literally how many times you filled that barrel. So generally, you see it almost as a year is seen as one fill generally. So when we buy the barrels, we have them branded with the year that we bought them on, so what the first vintage would be. So that obviously all the barrels that we bought this year that will be filled with 2020 wine, we'll have 2020 on. That is then the first fill. Next year, when we in 2021 use that same barrel, the 2020 barrels will be our second fill barrels. So the first time that you fill a barrel, you extract a lot of these flavors, a lot of the toastier aromas, a lot more oak, a lot more tannin from the barrel, from the oak as well. So there's a massive difference. That barrel is quite pungent, and sometimes first fill barrels can be a little bit too much, dominate the wine a bit too much. So that's why we don't use anymore. Well, some wineries do use 100% new oak, but we moved away from using 100% new oak, where on our Cabernet we're generally at around about 30 or 40% new oak, because the Cabernet can handle a bit more oak. On our Shiraz, we're more towards, on the PC, we're more at about 15% now, so a lot less. And then the rest is made up of second, third, and fourth full barrels generally. So after about 3 or 4 fills, the amount of flavor that you extract from the barrel becomes less and less and less. And about fourth fill, there's really not that much flavor that you extract. You still get the benefit, obviously, of the oxygen that's coming in, so you can still use those barrels. But for our premium stuff, it's more a combination of first, second, third, and maybe fourth full barrels. So for all the PCs, and then for guinea fowl, which is more entry level, more, or not entry level, but more approachable in style, and more fruit forward in style, we would use older barrels. So what we call neutral, you can call them neutral oak as well, because they don't really impart much flavor. And you can use barrels for, it depends on if you look after them well, because barrels can go off. Because the porous vessel, you can have microorganisms growing on the inside, and they can become acidic and go and give you all sorts of weird characters. So
not what you're looking for.
Depends on how you look after your barrels, but you can keep them for more than 10 years. But then obviously they won't impart a lot of oak flavor, but it's still a wonderful vessel to mature in. When it comes to the cost of the barrels, ranges a little bit, but generally for a 300-liter barrel, you're looking at around about 900 euros. So at the current exchange rate, I think that's about 18,000 Rand for 300 liters. So that adds a massive amount to your wine price.
Of course.
So you can, I mean, it's a quick sum to make what your Rand per liter is on that. If you were to use 100% new oak on a wine, at 18,000 Rand a liter, or 18,000 Rand a barrel for 300 liters, makes the wine quite expensive just on that.
Absolutely.
So barrels are expensive, and with the exchange rate, it's not going to be
not helping at this stage. So sorry, a few more questions, and they are part of what we were going to talk about as well. What are the volume? What size barrels are we using? And do we use similar volumes for each variety? I mean, do we swap it out, change it up?
So on our Chardonnay, we only have the Chardonnay that's really aged in oak. So the Chardonnay traditionally was fermented and aged in 225 liter and 300 liter barrels. We've moved to all the new oak is now, for the last 4 years have been 500-liter barrels. The reason being, the bigger the vessel, or the larger the volume of the barrel, the less oak flavors it gives to the wine. Obviously, the surface area per ratio of liter of wine is less the bigger the vessel. Therefore, on the Chardonnay, where we really want to shy away from the heavily oaky Chardonnay, we move towards the bigger format barrels. On the reds, we just use standard 300-liter barrels throughout the range. That is partly because that's what works for us, but there's also a practical component to it. If you have 4 different barrel sizes, you have to stack these barrels and put them in your barrel room, and it becomes quite a logistical nightmare if you've got some 225-liter barrels and some 300-liter barrels and some 400-liter barrels and 500-liter barrels, because you can't stack them on the same stack. You can't put them together. So there is a more practical logistical aspect to it as well. But generally, we on the reds, we just use 300 liters.
Yeah, the practicality, because obviously the barrels have to be in really a special room, I'm assuming, for temperature controlled, etc., etc. So yeah, they can't just be stacked anywhere. So then there's another question here, which is obviously a big topic, which we touched on it, but the French versus American oak versus the Eastern European oak. Have you got any thoughts on that? We've spoken about the French and American, but maybe the Eastern European oak as well.
So like I said, with the French and American, there's quite a big difference. I haven't actually worked that much with Eastern European oak. The little bit that I have tasted out of them, they are very good and more in style with leaning more towards French than American style, without a doubt. So they are definitely something that's definitely something that I was thinking about the other day as well, to experiment with maybe a bit of Hungarian oak or something like that, because it can definitely add something. You don't want to, you don't want to change the styles radically or anything like that, but it would be interesting to see how they work on our wines. But I haven't worked with Eastern European barrels on our site, so I can't really comment too much on that.
It would be interesting. So our topic for today was patience and the luxury of time. So maybe just give us some comments about how long our wines do stay in oak, what the kind of period of time is that you would prefer to, would you prefer to have them longer, shorter? How do you decide on that? And yeah.
Well, that's I think it's very much vintage dependent for me. So generally in vintages that you have more structure, that are bigger and bolder, you tend to leave them in barrel a little bit longer because they need that time for the tannins to soften and for that to happen. So then you can leave them in barrel a little bit longer. And the softer, thinner vintages you would probably take out of barrel a little bit sooner, because the oak can easily dominate the wine. We generally, this is not as a rule, but generally our private collection Shiraz and private collection Cabernet will stay in barrel for about 12 months. The triple S is generally a little bit longer, so the triple S will generally go up to about 24 months. And our Chardonnay is also about 12 months. But like I said, there's no set recipe. I don't like set recipes or set rules. So I will, after about 12 months, I'll taste the wine and then see if it needs to stay an extra, if it needs some more barrel aging. So if I feels it needs to develop a little bit more, I will put it back into barrel, and not necessarily if it came out of first, second, and third full barrels, I might put it back into fourth full barrels or even fifth full barrels, which is going to be a neutral oak. I don't want to impart any more oak flavor, but I still want that development that you get in the barrel. As soon as you take it to stainless steel, it's once again, it's a bit of a snapshot. The development is that much slower. So while you have the opportunity to find the wine, or to let the wine develop to its full potential, you'll definitely take that time. So and that's also, I mean, dependent on sales. At the end of the day, you have to sell the wine, and the wine has to go to market.
Yeah.
But
Thanks for
fortunately,
that a little added extra bit of pressure, Dirk.
so you have to. That's always the consideration as well. But if you can do your planning well enough and you do your production planning well enough, you shouldn't run into problems, and you should have ample time. Keep giving the wine more than enough time in barrel, and giving the wine time in bottle after bottling as well, because that's also important. As soon as when you bottle a wine, it's quite a shock. Generally, it goes through a filter, even if it's a very coarse filter, and even if you don't filter it, the wine is still pumped to the bottling line. It splashes or it falls into a bottle, and then gets a cork pushed on top of it. So it's quite a lot of shock to take. The wines generally just after bottling is a little bit confused and all over the place. So you need a few months after bottling for the wine to really settle, and to get to its full potential again.
Yeah, and then I mean, we will talk further, I guess, next week. But how long would you take to, I know it's dependent on sales, etc., but how long ideally would you like the wines to be in the bottle before they are actually out in the market? How long do they need to kind of settle and bring themselves together? Do you have a set recipe?
No, there's no set recipe really. It's also very much dependent on the particular wine and the style and all of that. And there's I haven't come across a set algorithm that you can plug in and work out how long the wine will need to get to its best. On whites, it's generally a little bit less, but it's also dependent on the style that you're going for. Sometimes Chardonnay with a bit of bottle age is actually, the wine should actually only drinking at its best 2 years down the line. But not everyone would buy a 3-year-old white wine necessarily, unfortunately. But generally a few months, ideally. I would not like to bottle a wine and sell it within a few weeks. I mean, some people do that on young Sauvignon Blanc. If you bring out Sauvignon Blanc in March, that is, you don't have the luxury of keeping in the bottle. So there's no patience involved in that.
No.
But for reds, I think upwards, if you can, for 6 months, that's generally great, just to really get it settled. But it is very much dependent, and you'll taste the wine a few times after bottling it to really see how it's developing and when you're happy to release it.
Yeah. So we have 2 great questions that have just come in, but I think that we're going to have to, one is about closures, which is on our agenda for next week. So Clint, please, I know you've tuned in every week, but come back next week and we'll answer those questions. And Bjorn had a good question about a beautifully wooded Chardonnay. So I think we might have to just take those over to next week and go through those. But thank you for all the questions. I see that people are much more engaging on this topic. Maybe we'll have to do another week of this, Dirk, because it seems a popular topic.
Yeah, I think we can move next week. We can just do a take 2 of this same topic.
Okay, all right, we'll do that. But thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. If you would like to follow us on our YouTube channel to see the recordings of these and other videos that we've made during this time, you can just follow us there. Please could you also rate us on Vivino. Vivino is a great app that you can connect with other wine lovers, and it also is a great record of the wines that you're tasting and that you maybe prefer or don't prefer. I use it quite extensively, and in fact have connected with great people on Vivino. Next time we'll be talking to Dirk again, and it's all about what's next and the kind of crystal ball scenario. So please, I'll send out the invite next week, and we'd love you to join us. We've included a prize draw for this week again for a magnum of private collection Shiraz, and we asked Chantal to do the draw, and she drew the name David Russell. So David, congratulations. We will send you your gift as soon as we can, which will be hopefully sooner rather than later. And then we look forward to welcoming you back next week to our next episode of Saxenburg, A Year in the Life. And cheers to you all. Thank you very much for joining us. Cheers.
Thank you so much, everyone. Appreciate it.